Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we journey far beyond the sword into a time where legend and memory drift together like mist upon the ancient hills. This is the tale of Arthur, not the warrior of conquest, but the dream of a better world. A story born from Britain's twilight, where myth was history and hope wore the face of a king. So, close your eyes, let the day fade, and allow the calm voice of history to guide you. You are listening to Go to Sleep, Historian, where the past whispers softly, and time itself becomes a lullaby. The world before Arthur, and the centuries after Rome's long shadow withdrew from the island of Britain, the land fell into a silence that was neither peace nor ruin. The stone roads that had once carried legions now lay quiet beneath moss and thorn. Towns that had been built with order and reason faded into half-remembered shapes, their baths filled with rainwater, their villas sinking gently into the soil. The empire's voice, once commanding in marble and Latin, grew faint as the sound of the wind took its place. Yet within that hush, something new was forming, not of empire, but of memory and legend. The world before Arthur was not the age of knights and shining swords that later poets would dream of. It was an age of broken provinces, shifting loyalties, and fragile hope. The people who lived among the ruins of Rome were neither Romans nor yet quite Britons, as their ancestors had been. There was something in between, heirs to lost power, survivors of forgotten order. Their farms spread among half-collapsed villas. Their faith wandered between the old gods and the new Christ. To them, the world seemed old and uncertain, a twilight between the fall of one age and the dawn of another. In the absence of the empire, small kings rose and fell like waves. Each claimed a fragment of the old world as his own, carving his rule from hill forts and moats. They fought not for conquest, but for endurance, to keep a hearth burning, to hold a valley against the dark. The wars of those times were not glorious. They were weary, repetitive, often unseen beyond the next ridge. Yet out of that weariness, legends took root. For when men struggle long enough in the dust, they begin to dream of someone who will rise above it all. The chroniclers of later centuries would try to name the age, to measure it in kings and battles. They wrote of Ambrosius Aurelianus, perhaps a noble of Roman blood who rallied his people against invaders. They mentioned Vortigern, whose weakness invited ruin, and Hengist and Horsa, who came across the sea with their Saxon spears. But the truth was never neat. The island was a quilt of people's picks from the north, Celts in the west, Saxons in the east, each telling their own stories of what had been lost and what might be regained. The name Arthur had not yet been spoken clearly, but somewhere in those troubled fields, the shape of the legend was forming. The landscape itself seemed to remember what men forgot. Old hill forts stood like sleeping beasts over the valleys. Stone circles caught the moonlight, their purpose long gone but their mystery unbroken. Streams carried names that no one could translate, but everyone felt they meant something. This was the Britain of shadows and echoes, where every ruined tower suggested a story waiting to be told. The monks who later wrote of Arthur could not resist such a landscape. It was a place already half-dreaming, and dreams are where legends are born. In those early centuries, faith and fear were neighbors. Christianity had come with the Romans, but it had not erased the older reverence for earth and sky. People still buried charms beneath their doorways, still whispered to the stones at dawn. The churchmen who tried to guide them found themselves speaking in two languages at once, the language of scripture and the language of superstition. A priest might pray over a well, calling it holy water, while the villagers still thought of it as the dwelling of a spirit. This blending of belief would later give Arthurian legend its strange beauty. Christian virtue interwoven with pagan wonder. The economy of the island had changed too. Trade routes grew faint. 10 benice, a pot from Gaul, a coin from Rome, became relics rather than currency. In their place grew local crafts, rough but enduring. Villagers learned to be self-sufficient, to rely on the rhythm of the seasons rather than the schedules of governors. Each valley became its own small world, and stories became the bridges between them. A traveling bard might be the only link a remote farmstead had with the next kingdom. In his songs, truth and imagination mingled freely. When he spoke of a great leader who defended the people from chaos, who could say if he spoke of a man or a dream? In time, the memory of Rome itself became part of the myth. The ruined roads were said to have been laid by giants. The walls of old cities were thought to hold hidden treasure. Children were warned not to walk among the fallen stones at night, lest they wake the spirits of forgotten soldiers. History blurred into legend not because people stopped remembering, but because remembering became a kind of storytelling. To survive, stories had to soothe as well as explain. They became softer, slower, more like comfort than chronicle. Among the hills of Wales and Cornwall, certain names began to gather weight. There was talk of a war leader who fought 12 great battles, who stood against the Saxon tide. His banner, it was said, bore the image of a dragon. His men followed him not for gold or land, but for hope. Yet no one agreed where he had lived, or even if he had lived at all. Some said he was a shadow of Ambrosius, others that he was born of prophecy. To one monk, he was a warning. To another, a miracle. What mattered was not his accuracy, but his persistence. The name, Arthur, began to shimmer at the edge of history like heat above a road. The silence of the Dark Ages was never total. Beneath the quiet, there were scribes at work, small monasteries keeping the embers of knowledge alive. Their world was not grand, but it was steady. A monk might spend a lifetime copying a single book, his hand tracing letters that outlasted empires. He wrote by candlelight, in the company of silence and time. For him, the stories of the past were both duty and prayer. It was through such hands that the faint memory of early heroes was preserved, not as history, but as faith. That courage still existed in a fallen world. To imagine that world is to step into a place where the known and the forgotten coexist. The Roman walls still stood in some towns, but ivy climbed over them. Roads led to nowhere, yet people still walked them, following habits older than memory. In the forests, wolves roamed. In their fields, farmers turned up coins and fragments of pottery, unaware that they were living among the ruins of a vanished order. Each generation added its own stories to the land. A field where a chieftain had fallen became haunted ground. A hill where fires once burned became a beacon of warning. Over centuries, these fragments of rumor and reverence would weave together into something larger, a legend that could speak for them all. It was not a single author or age that made Arthur. It was the collective dream of a people who needed him. When history grows uncertain, when the past is too heavy and the future too dim, the imagination fills the gap. Arthur emerged not as a man, but as a memory of what men wished to be: loyal, brave, steadfast, just. In that sense, he was less a person than a reflection, an image of light held up against a long night. And like light, he could take many forms, appearing wherever the need for hope was strongest. The geography of that time invites stillness. The wind moved slowly over the hills, carrying the scent of peat and heather. Streams wound through valleys, their surfaces silver under a dim sun. In small clearings, smoke rose from thatched roofs, tin and blue. The people who lived their new hardship as naturally as breath. They worked, ate, prayed, and slept by the rhythms of nature. To them, the distant wars of kings were like weather, inevitable, unpredictable, and beyond their reach. Yet even among the humble, stories were shared by the fire, told in voices soft enough not to wake the children. They spoke of bravery and betrayal, of magic and mourning. In those whispers, the legend of Arthur was already alive, long before it found its name. The bards and chroniclers of the centuries to come would look back on that world with longing. To them, it was a golden age dimly remembered, when men were noble and faith was pure. In truth, it was rough and uncertain, but from a distance, even hardship becomes beautiful. Perhaps that is the nature of old legend, to polish memory until it gleams. The world before Arthur was not an age of glory, but an age of need. And need is the most fertile soil for myth. As the 6th century approached, the Saxon migrations grew stronger. Settlers from across the sea brought new customs, new tongues, and new gods. Villages along the eastern coast vanished or changed beyond recognition. Yet in the western hills, resistance held on, stubborn, quiet, persistent. The people of those lands kept their stories as a shield. If they could not keep the cities, they would keep the spirit. That, too, is part of the Arthurian legacy. The belief that while power may fade, meaning endures, The world before Arthur was therefore not empty, but waiting. It was a pause between empires, a breath before the next age of words. Its silence was full of potential, its darkness full of unseen stars. Out of its quiet soil would grow the myth that would outlast all kingdoms, a story told not for triumph, but for comfort. For even in their uncertainty, those early Britons believed in something greater than themselves. The idea that somewhere, in some hidden valley or hall, a leader still kept watch. The legend's first roots lay not in marble halls, but in oral breath, in the patient rhythm of speech that carried across firelight. Long before parchment preserved a word of Arthur's name, his story existed in fragments of conversation, in song, in the murmur of travelers sheltering from the rain. The bard, more than the soldier, became the guardian of memory. To those who listened, he offered not just entertainment but identity, a sense that the people of this island still belonged to a story greater than the wars that surrounded them. By the 7th century, those spoken legends had begun to shift in form. What had once been local tales of defense and endurance became grander, more unified. A single figure began to draw the scattered hopes together, a war leader whose courage gave shape to a restless age. The chroniclers who finally set his name to ink did not invent him from nothing. They gathered what the land itself had been whispering. Even in its ruin, Britain had not forgotten the echo of leadership. To write of Arthur was to give that echo a body. For centuries, scholars have searched for evidence of this man: a tomb, a fortress, a battle site that could prove he lived. Some point to Cabri Hill, others to South Cabri, or to a dozen other hills bearing his shadow. Yet the truest part of his story may lie not in the ground, but in the persistence of the telling. When the world grows dark, people look for a figure to walk with a torch ahead of them. Whether or not Arthur walked in flesh, he walked in imagination, and imagination can outlast stone. In the monasteries, where time moved at the pace of prayer, the monks slowly gathered these stories. Their Latin records were sparse and uncertain, but their purpose was not precision, it was preservation. A line here, a note there. A great battle at Mount Badon, led by Arthur. Nothing more. And yet those few words would ripple across centuries. They were seeds waiting for gentler soil. When later writers found them, they saw not the bare mention of a warrior, but the outline of a legend ready to bloom. To understand why these stories survived, one must imagine the atmosphere of early medieval Britain, the grey mornings, the low chant of bells across mystic valleys, the patient labor of farmers who could not read but who carried stories in their hearts. Their lives were not measured by victories, but by endurance. Every harvest that came and went was a triumph, every child who lived past winter a quiet miracle. In such a world, the tale of a noble leader who stood firm against darkness was not fantasy. It was nourishment. The art of storytelling in those times was simple, almost sacred. A bard might speak for hours, his words slow and rhythmic, his audience half asleep, yet listening deeply. There were no written scripts, only the music of memory. The stories changed slightly with each telling, shaped by the needs of the listeners. In one valley, Arthur fought invaders. In another, he defended the faith. To the hill folk, he was a shepherd. To the monks, a defender of God's law. The legend stretched like light through stained glass, the same radiance, refracted in countless ways. The idea of a unified Britain was itself a dream, and perhaps that is what made the legend so powerful. In a land of many tongues and rival chiefs, the story of Arthur offered an image of harmony. A circle of loyalty around a single just ruler. Even before the Round Table was imagined, the longing for order was there. The people did not yet have the words for Camelot, but they felt the ache for such a place. A kingdom not of stone, but of spirit, where strength served mercy and courage guarded peace. The centuries that followed the Roman retreat were often cruel. Raiders came from the sea. Plagues swept through towns. Famine gnawed at the edges of every harvest. Yet through all this, the idea of Arthur endured, changing shape but never disappearing. When a village was burned, its survivors rebuilt and told once more the story of the great leader who would return. When a child asked why the ruins on the hills stood empty, an elder might whisper that Arthur slept there, waiting for the island to call him again. In that sense, the legend became a form of prayer. Not to the gods of the sky, but to the courage within the human heart. The poets of later centuries, when they looked back upon this dark and rugged age, often described it as primitive or tragic, but there was a quiet wisdom in its endurance. People learned to find beauty and simplicity in the turning of seasons, in the constancy of the stars, in the stories that outlived sorrow. The world before Arthur was not empty of greatness. It was simply greatness, seen through humble eyes. It is easy, from the distance of history, to imagine that this age was defined by war alone. Yet peace, too, left its traces. The fields that were plowed again and again, the hearths rebuilt after fire, the monasteries that continued their chanting through every storm. All these were acts of faith, as brave as any battle. The legend of Arthur would later take these quiet acts and wrap them in gold and glory, but their origin was far gentler. At Titsaert, the myth began as a thankfulness for resilience, a story about the endurance of good people in difficult times. As centuries passed, memory began to fold upon itself. What had been history became legend. What had been legend became moral teaching. Each generation found something new within the same old name. For the Britons of the early Middle Ages, Arthur was a symbol of hope. For the Norman poets, he became a model of chivalry. For the chroniclers of later England, he was a symbol of unity and rightful rule. But beneath all these interpretations lay the same foundation, that first quiet dream of order born from chaos. Archaeologists today find traces of that world, a fragment of pottery here, a buried wall there. Yet the truer archaeology lies in the imagination. Every time the story is retold, another layer of the past is revealed, not through bones or ruins, but through words. That is how history continues to breathe, even when its monuments crumble. The world before Arthur is gone, but it lingers in the imagination of those who still tell his tale. There is a certain comfort in that thought. Empires rise and fall. Languages change. But the need to believe in nobility endures. The first listeners who heard the songs of Arthur did not need to know whether he was real. It was enough that he represented what they wished to see in themselves. Courage without cruelty, faith without pride, leadership without tyranny. Those are the qualities that survive when nations vanish. If one could walk through that world, through the wet fields of the West, past the stone remnants of Roman walls, down to the quiet rivers that once bore trade boats, one might sense the beginnings of something sacred in its simplicity. The people had little, but they had memory, and memory is wealth of a different kind. In their evenings, when the work was done and the fire burned low, they spoke of heroes not because they expected them, but because it made the waiting easier, and so the story gathered strength. From one century to the next, it was carried like an ember through darkness. By the time the medieval writers found it, it had already lived 100 lives. They would give it armor and kingship, give it names for every knight and every lady, but the heart of it, the quiet resilience of a weary people, would remain unchanged. That is what gives the legend its strange peace. Beneath the swords and quests and sorcery lies something far more human. The dream that even in ruins, goodness endures. When at last the poets called Arthur the once and future king, they were giving words to it, feeling that it existed since the beginning, the belief that virtue might sleep but never die. It was not merely about a ruler's return, but about the return of balance, of gentleness in a hard world. That belief had been seeded in the dark soil of the centuries after Rome, watered by memory, tended by storytellers. It has never quite stopped growing. Thus ends the age before Arthur. Not with a conclusion, but with an awakening. The land that had known so much silence was ready to speak again. In the next telling, the names would multiply. Ambrosius, Merlin, Lancelot, Guinevere. The monks would take up their quills, the poets their verse, and out of the murmur of centuries would emerge the voice of a king who may never have lived, yet who would never die. The birth of the myth in the quiet centuries that followed the fading of Rome. Stories became the lifeblood of memory. History no longer lived in marble or in law, but in the soft murmur of voices and the scratch of quills within monasteries. The land that had once echoed with the march of legions now hummed instead with the sound of prayer and recollection. Across the British Isles, the habit of remembering began to take a new shape. The mythic, and at the heart of those forming legends, the name of Arthur began to glow, faintly at first, like the first ember in a hearth at dusk. The earliest tellers of the Arthurian story were not poets seeking beauty, but record-keepers seeking meaning. The 5th and 6th centuries had left the island fragmented, its tribes uncertain of their future, its faith scattered between old gods and the new church. It was in that uncertainty that chroniclers began to look backward, not forward. They wrote of a leader who had once held the darkness at bay, not because they could prove he lived, but because they needed to believe he had. Among the first to give Arthur a place in written memory was the Welsh cleric Nennius, who, sometime around the early 9th century, compiled a curious work known as the Historia Brittonum, the history of the Britons. In its lines, Arthur appears suddenly, without explanation, described as a warrior who fought 12 great battles against the invading Saxons. The text offers no lineage, no description of his face, no mention of a round table or of Camelot. He is simply there, moving from battle to battle, the embodiment of resistance. For Nennius, that was enough. The legend did not yet need decoration. It needed purpose. The battles themselves, whose names scatter across the page like stones from a broken road, are difficult to place. Some seem real, drawn from geography. Others are mysteries, perhaps borrowed from the songs of earlier storytellers. Yet the cumulative effect is powerful, a rhythm of defiance, of a man who fought and did not fall. In a world of decay, such constancy was its own kind of miracle. The chronicler, bound by duty to record what he could, may not have believed every word, but he preserved the possibility, and possibility is the seed of all myth. Another early source, the Annal Cambria, the Welsh Annals, written perhaps a century later, mentions 2 brief events that bear Arthur's name. The first is the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur is said to have carried the cross of Christ and won a great victory. The second, more somber, is his death at Camelot, together with Medrau, whose name would later echo as more. The entries are sparse, only a few lines each, yet they pulse with quiet significance. They mark the first time the story gains both triumph and tragedy, the 2 poles between which all great legends turn. The monks who copied those texts could not have known they were shaping one of the most enduring myths of the Western world. To them, the work was merely a record, a small act of order against the chaos of time. They wrote with deliberate slowness, each letter an act of devotion, each name a fragile bridge between the past and the present. Yet through their hands, Arthur moved from the uncertain realm of rumor into the gentle permanence of ink. In that act, he ceased to be just a figure of speech. He became a story. The transformation of Arthur from history to legend did not happen overnight. It was a slow drift, guided by language itself. Latin gave way to the tongues of the Britons, and in those words, the story began to breathe differently. Welsh poets, known as the bards, took up the tale and wove it with imagery drawn from nature, storms, starlight, and the fierce calm of mountains. To them, Arthur was not merely a warrior but a part of the land's soul. His courage was the courage of rivers that never stopped flowing. His endurance, the endurance of the hills. One of the oldest of these poets, Taliesin, sang of Arthur as though he were both man and myth. His verses blur the boundaries between the mortal and the mystical, describing Arthur as a traveler through strange lands, a conqueror of beasts, a speaker with the dead. Whether those lines were meant literally or symbolically is unclear, and it scarcely matters. What they reveal is how legend begins to outgrow its own beginnings. A name that once stood for a single leader becomes a vessel large enough to contain a people's imagination. Through these songs and stories, Arthur moved further from history and closer to eternity. He became less the memory of a man and more the dream of a kingdom, a vision of order and honor in a world still mired in struggle. It was not deceit that transformed him, but longing. When a society is fragmented, its greatest need is unity. When faith is tested, its greatest hope is purity. Arthur answered both needs, not as fact, but as feeling. In him, the weary found comfort. The faithful found reflection. The storytellers found a mirror. By the time these oral traditions reached the learned scholars of later centuries, Arthur had already lived many lives. To some, he was the Christian hero defending the faith. To others, he was the Celtic champion, heir to druidic wisdom. To still others, he was the sleeping king, hidden beneath a hill, destined to rise again. Each telling added a new layer, and the original warrior, if such a man had ever existed, slipped quietly beneath the weight of his own fame. What remained was a presence, a gentle certainty that something noble had once walked among men. The chroniclers did not invent that presence. They simply gave it a clearer voice. By the 12th century, when Geoffrey of Monmouth composed his Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain, the myth had reached full bloom. But long before Geoffrey's quill touched parchment, the ground had been prepared by centuries of quiet belief. Nennius and the Welsh poets had built the foundation. The monks of countless abbeys had tended the flame. Without their quiet labor, Geoffrey's grand vision would have had nothing to stand upon. And so, in those dim centuries between the fall of Rome and the flowering of medieval chivalry, the legend of Arthur was born, not in courts or castles, but in the solitude of faith and memory. It grew like ivy on the ruins of empire, winding its way through the cracks of history, finding life where reason found none. Each monk who copied a line, each bard who sang a verse, became a small link in the chain that bound the myth to time. They did not know they were shaping a legend. They only knew they were keeping something precious alive. To understand the birth of a myth is to understand the human need for continuity. People cannot bear the thought that goodness ends. When kingdoms fall and rulers fail, imagination steps forward to mend what history has broken. Arthur was, in that sense, a repair, an act of spiritual restoration. He stood for the belief that justice once existed and might exist again. It was a comforting illusion, perhaps, but one powerful enough to survive every age that followed. Even today, when scholars debate the boundaries between history and invention, there remains something serene in the way Arthur's story began. It did not rise from conquest or politics, but from a collective whisper of remembrance. The people of Britain, adrift between their pagan past and Christian present, found in him a bridge between worlds. He was both ancient and eternal, both man and myth, both history and hope. The myth was not born in a single moment, nor from a single pen. It was a long dawn, a slow spreading of light through centuries of shadow. And like dawn, it was less an arrival than a revelation, not something new appearing, but something old remembered. When Geoffrey of Monmouth set his hand to the parchment in the 12th century, he did not simply write history. He conjured a vision. The world around him had changed beyond the quiet centuries that preceded him. Stone churches rose where wooden chapels once stood. Norman lords held the land, and Latin learning returned to Britain with new confidence. Yet, beneath the surface, the hunger for belonging remained. Geoffrey sensed it, and in his Historia Regum Britannia, his history of the kings of Britain, he offered the island what it longed for most: a noble ancestry crowned by the reign of a perfect king. His Arthur was no longer a shadow on the edge of memory. He became a full and radiant presence. Born of royal blood, guided by prophecy, and anointed by destiny. The text begins with Brutus, the mythical founder of Britain, and from that legendary lineage, Geoffrey traced the arc of British kings through centuries. Then to the shining figure of Arthur rose. As its highest point, what Nennius had only hinted at, Geoffrey transformed into a sweeping epic, rich with triumphs, betrayals, and wonders. In his telling, Arthur conquers not only the Saxons but distant lands as well, building an empire that rivals Rome itself. He is bold, wise, and divinely favored. The pages unfold like a tapestry, filled with grand councils, sacred relics, and the sound of battle drums echoing through forests and fields. Around him gather knights of courage and loyalty, men whose names had not yet been fixed in legend, but whose presence hints at the company that, later, centuries would call the Round Table. For Geoffrey, Arthur's reign was not merely history, it was allegory. It represented an ideal order, a harmony between strength and virtue. In the uncertain politics of Norman England, such a vision carried meaning far beyond its pages. A people still uneasy with conquest could look to Arthur and see in him a shared inheritance, a reminder that greatness might return to their island. The myth became, for the first time, national. Geoffrey's work spread with astonishing speed. Copies multiplied in monasteries and courts, translated from Latin into French and Welsh, retold and reshaped in every tongue that carried dreams. His invention of Merlin, the prophetic wizard who guided kings, gave the story its pulse of mystery. Through Merlin's voice, Geoffrey spoke of fate and the cycles of time, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the promise that Arthur would someday return when his people needed him most. That promise, soft as a prayer, would echo through the centuries. The monks who read Geoffrey's chronicle may have doubted its historical truth, but few doubted its emotional power. Here was a story that reconciled faith and wonder, reason and hope. It offered a noble mirror in which the medieval soul could see itself, brave, pious, and yet haunted by loss. The death of Arthur in Geoffrey's account, brought about by betrayal and sorrow, did not end the legend, but deepened it. In death, Arthur became both martyr and memory, his body taken to Avalon, his spirit unbroken. It was not an ending, but an invitation to remember, to retell, to believe. Soon after Geoffrey, the legend crossed the Channel and found new life in the courts of France. There, poets of the 12th century, men like Chrétien de Troyes, took the rough brilliance of Geoffrey's tale and polished it with the grace of courtly romance. The warriors became knights, bound by a code of chivalry. Battles gave way to quests. Love, once a distant ornament in old chronicles, became the soul of the story. And at the heart of that transformation stood Queen Guinevere and Sir Lancelot, figures of devotion and desire whose sorrow would become as famous as their loyalty. It was in these French romances that the Round Table first appeared a simple but powerful symbol. Its shape, without head or foot, promised equality among those who served. In that circle lay the dream of a perfect fellowship, a vision of harmony that transcended hierarchy. The knights who gathered there were not mere warriors, but seekers of purity and grace. Their adventures, filled with trials and temptations, reflected the moral struggles of an age striving toward ideal virtue. From these tales grew the quest for the Holy Grail, a new mystery that wove Christian devotion into the old Celtic fabric. The Grail was many things at once: a chalice, a light, a divine mystery. To some, it was the cup of the Last Supper. To others, it was a symbol of eternal truth, glimpsed but never held. In the Grail quest, Arthur's knights became pilgrims of the soul, wandering through forests of illusion and faith, each seeking redemption. The myth had begun as a memory of war. It had become a meditation on salvation. As the centuries turned, each retelling carried its own reflection of the age that bore it. In Wales, the bards still sang of Arthur as a hero of the old gods, while in the monasteries, Latin scribes saw him as a champion of Christian virtue. The legend spread northward into Scotland, where he was said to have hunted among the misted hills, and westward into Cornwall, where caves and headlands still bear his name. Every region claimed a fragment of his presence. The boundaries between faith and folklore dissolved, leaving behind only the quiet certainty that Arthur had once been somewhere, somehow, in the deep dawn of history. Through all these transformations, the essence of the myth remained the same. It was the story of a world that almost achieved perfection, a golden order that could not endure. The Round Table fell to jealousy and pride. The Grail was glimpsed but lost. Camelot faded into silence. Yet in that fall lay the enduring beauty of the legend, for it told not of failure, but of the yearning that defines humanity, the wish to create a kingdom that reflects the divine, even if only for a moment. The storytellers who shaped Arthur's myth were not deceived by illusion. They knew that every age builds its own paradise and loses it. Their genius lay in turning that sorrow into song. By giving the fall of Camelot a voice, they taught their listeners to cherish what is fleeting: courage, friendship, honor, and love, because all are destined to fade, and only memory remains. In that sensei, the Arthurian myth became more than a tale of knights and kings. It became a quiet philosophy of impermanence. By the end of the Middle Ages, the story had become a vast mirror, reflecting every dream of Europe. The scholars saw wisdom in it, the knights saw glory, the lovers saw tragedy, and the poets saw eternity. Its endurance was not due to certainty, but to mystery. Arthur's grave was never found, his sword never rusted, his promise never withdrawn. He remained always on the edge of return, the sleeping king beneath the hill, waiting for his island is a word of need. And so, the myth, once born from fragile memory, had grown into something indestructible. It had outlived kingdoms, languages, and empires. What began as a line in a monkish chronicle had become a cathedral of imagination. Vast, luminous, and endlessly echoing, the story of Arthur had crossed from parchment into prayer, from song into silence, and from history into the gentle realm of dream. For centuries to come, storytellers would walk the same path, carrying the torch Geoffrey had kindled. Some would write of betrayal, others of redemption. Some would dream of knights in shining armor, others of the quiet hills of Avalon. But all would share one belief, that somewhere, beneath the tides of time, the once and future king still rests, and that his story, like all great legends, is never truly finished. Merlin and the prophets of time. Long before the halls of Camelot rose in story, there was already talk of a figure who walked between worlds, a man neither wholly mortal nor wholly divine, whose words fell like mist upon the edges of history. He would come to be known as Merlin, though in the oldest tongues he had other names. Murden, Ambris, the wild prophet of the woods. He was the keeper of forgotten wisdom, the voice of the land itself, and through his shadowed presence the Arthurian world would find its soul. In the centuries when legends still clung to the roots of the earth, the image of a wild seer haunted the western hills of Britain. The poets of Wales told of Murden Wilt, a man driven mad by the sorrows of war, who fled into the forest after the Battle of Arthur. There he lived among the beasts, speaking to the winds and the stars, his mind filled with visions of what was and what was yet to be. To the listeners of those early songs, he was both cursed and blessed, a mirror of the world's own brokenness, touched by divine madness. It is from this wandering prophet that Geoffrey of Monmouth shaped his Merlin, blending fragments of myth with threads of history. In Geoffrey's pages, the seer first appears as a strange boy born without a father, whose mother swears her child was conceived by a spirit. When the tyrant Vortigern seeks to build a fortress, the walls crumble again and again, until the boy explains that two dragons lie buried beneath the hill. One red, one white, locked in eternal battle. When they are unearthed, they rise to fight, and the red dragon, symbol of the Britons, triumphs over the white of the Saxons. From that moment, Merlin's voice becomes the pulse of prophecy itself. The tale is not merely superstition. It is allegory wrapped in dream. The dragons are nations, the hill is history, and the child's voice is the whisper of fate. Geoffrey's readers, living in an age of shifting loyalties and uncertain borders, found in Merlin a reflection of their own world, a reminder that destiny, Tu Giden, always stirs beneath the surface. His prophecies, written in rolling Latin, speak of future kings, of wars yet to come, of a Britain that will fall and rise again. They are not predictions to be measured, but meditations to be felt. In this way, Merlin became something greater than a character. He was a bridge between ages, joining the pagan reverence for nature with the Christian sense of divine order. He spoke of stars and spirits, yet his wisdom pointed toward faith. His madness, often described in sorrowful tones, was not punishment, but perception, a vision too vast for reason to contain. To medieval minds, he embodied the uneasy beauty of knowledge, the idea that understanding the future might also mean being forever apart from the world one loves. As the legend grew, later writers deepened his mystery. Some said he lived backward through time, remembering the future as others recall the past. Others told that he built Stonehenge by calling the stones across the sea through song. Still others imagined him as the secret guardian who watched over Arthur's birth, ensuring that the destined child would rise when the kingdom most needed him. Each version changed the details, yet the essence remained Merlin as the keeper of time, the still center of the turning world. To the monks who copied Geoffrey's text, Merlin's miracles carried moral weight. His voice reminded them of the prophets of old: Isaiah, Elijah, John the Baptist, men who spoke in riddles, because truth itself was too large for plain speech. To the poets, however, he was the spirit of Britain's older soul, the echo of its sacred groves and its lost gods. In him the Christian and the Celtic met, not in conflict, but in conversation. His life was a bridge, and his silence, when it came, was always a kind of prayer. Even in madness, Merlin was never cruel. The stories tell that he could calm storms with a word, that animals gathered near him as if to listen. In the wilderness, he found communion, not exile. When he gazed upon the hills, he saw not mere landscape, but the memory of creation itself. The rivers carried voices. The stones whispered of ages long past. To those who sought his counsel, he spoke softly, for he knew that wisdom shouted is soon forgotten, but wisdom whispered may stay in the heart forever. As centuries passed, the figure of Merlin drifted further from his historical root and deeper into the realm of timeless myth. Yet always he remained the conscience of the Arthurian world, the one who foresaw the glory of Camelot and the sorrow that must follow. In later retellings, when Arthur draws the sword from the stone, Merlin stands unseen nearby, not as master but as witness. When Guinevere arrives and love takes its quiet, fateful course, Merlin already knows the ending. His knowledge is his burden, and his burden is endless, watching. Through him, the legend of Arthur becomes not only a tale of courage, but a meditation on destiny. The knights may ride, the kings may rule, but Merlin walks beside them, listening to the slow turning of time. He is the breath between prophecy and memory, the still point from which all motion begins. And in this way, as stories spread from monastery to court, the idea of Merlin grew gentle and immense, a symbol of all that is mysterious, yet wise, in human longing. For every age needs its prophet, and every heart, in secret, hungers for a voice that sees beyond the veil of days. When the time came for Arthur to enter the world, it was Merlin who shaped the path. The land was restless then, divided by ambition and haunted by the ghosts of fallen kings. Uther Pendragon, proud and desperate, sought the throne's stability through both might and desire. And as the stories tell, it was Merlin who guided him, not with the force of command, but with the quiet inevitability of fate. The tale of Arthur's conception, whispered through countless retellings, carries both wonder and sorrow. Uther's longing for Igraine, wife of the Duke of Cornwall, threatened to plunge the realm into ruin. Seeing the danger, Merlin offered a strange counsel. He would weave an illusion, shaping Uther in the likeness of Igraine's husband, so that desire might fulfill its destiny without open war. Yet in that act of enchantment, something greater moved beneath the surface, the birth of the king who would unite Britain. When Arthur came into the world, Merlin took him from his mother's arms and delivered him into secrecy, to be raised in safety until his hour arrived. It was an act both tender and terrible, for in protecting the child, Merlin also surrendered him to the solitude of destiny. Arthur would grow without knowing his royal blood, his childhood marked not by luxury but by quiet labor and learning. The old seer watched from afar, guiding events like a gardener tending a seed he cannot touch. He knew that all greatness demands sacrifice, and he bore that knowledge with the patience of centuries. When the boy reached manhood, the kingdom stood on the edge of despair. Uther was gone, the throne unclaimed, and the barons of Britain warred over its shadow. Then appeared the stone and the sword, a marvel no one could explain. Upon its blade were words in ancient script. Whoso pulleth out this sword from this stone is rightwise, king born of all England. Knights and nobles tried their strength in vain. The steel would not yield. It waited for the hand that was meant to hold it. And when Arthur, still unaware of his birthright, came upon it in simple need, the impossible happened. He drew the sword icily, not as a conqueror, but as one fulfilling a quiet promise. In that moment, Merlin's long labor reached its fulfillment. The boy became the king. The land, fractured and weary, found its symbol of renewal. Yet even in triumph, Merlin's heart carried the ache of foresight. He saw not only the glory that would follow, but also the sorrow that must one day undo it. For such is the nature of vision, to glimpse both dawn and dusk in the same light. Still, he did not turn away. He became Arthur's teacher and counselor, shaping the ideals that would define the Round Table. Justice without cruelty, courage without pride, faith without blindness. Under his guidance, The young king learned that power was not command but service, and that greatness without mercy is hollow. Together, they built the dream of Camelot. In its halls, the vision of an ordered and virtuous world took shape. Knights gathered from distant lands, drawn by the promise of honor. Laws were written, banners raised, songs composed. The people spoke of a golden age, and in their joy they forgot the shadow that always follows light. Merlin did not forget. He knew that the wheel of time turns for all things, kings, kingdoms, and even dreams. But he said nothing. Some truths must be carried in silence. Among the many tales told of Merlin's later days, few agree on how his story ends. Some say he fell in love with the Lady of the Lake, a woman of deep enchantment who learned his secrets and used them to bind him in sleep. Others say he withdrew to the forest, weary of the noise of men, and there became once more the wild prophet of his youth, singing to the trees and watching the stars. There are even whispers that he still walks unseen, a shadow between dawn and dusk, whispering to those who will listen. Whatever the truth, his departure left the world quieter. Without his counsel, the harmony of Camelot began to tremble. Yet even in absence, Merlin's spirit endured. His prophecies lingered in the songs of the bards, his wisdom in the vows of the knights. To speak of him was to remember that knowledge is both gift and burden, and that the wisest hearts are often those that choose stillness over power. The figure of Merlin, as it drifted through the centuries, became something larger than any single tale. Two scholars. He was the image of ancient learning, the last echo of druidic lore. Two poets. He was the eternal hermit, the guardian of mystery. To dreamers, he was hope-proof that there exists in the world a wisdom that sees beyond our frailty. In every age, people turn to his name as to a symbol of guidance, a reminder that truth often hides in the quiet places of the soul. And perhaps that is his truest legacy, not the magic, nor the prophecy, but the patience, the stillness with which he watched the rise and fall of kings, knowing that every end is a beginning in disguise. His story reminds us that wisdom is not found in the noise of command, but in the gentleness of understanding, in the soft turning of time. As Camelot rose and would one day fall, Merlin's shadow remained at the edge of every legend, unseen but felt, like the wind that shapes the forest without ever being seen among the trees. He was, and is still, the quiet heart of the Arthurian dream. The sword and the stone. The age of Arthur began not with thunder but with stillness. When he drew the sword from the stone, the act seemed almost accidental, the gesture of a young man fulfilling a need, not a prophecy. Yet in that quiet moment, something ancient stirred beneath the skin of Britain. The land, long divided by rival lords and weary of endless strife, felt the pulse of unity return. Those who had doubted the tales of old found themselves whispering once more of destiny. And in the heart of it all, the nameless boy who had lived in shadow stepped into the light of legend. Arthur did not yet understand what the sword meant. It gleamed in his hand, cool and weightless, a mystery that carried its own gravity. Around him, men who had fought and bled for power stared in disbelief. How could one so young, so humble, command what they could not? But the truth of the sword was not in strength of arm. It was in the quiet alignment of purpose and fate. Merlin, watching from a distance, saw it with serene certainty. The world had turned as it must. The king had come, not by conquest, but by the will of time itself. The sword and the stone, later called by some Celeborn, became the emblem of rightful rule. Yet it was not the same as the sword that would come after. For the true weapon of Arthur's reign, the one sung in every age, was Excalibur, born not of earth, but of water, drawn from the hand of the Lady of the Lake. Between those two blades lies the passage from promise to power, the transformation of the boy who proved his right to the man who bore the burden of kingship. When Arthur was crowned, his first thoughts were not of glory, but of peace. The kingdom he inherited was frayed like an old tapestry. Saxons pressing from the east, Picts from the north, old feuds festering in the west. He rode across the land with Merlin beside him, seeking to mend rather than to conquer. The people saw in him something rare, a ruler who listened, and slowly the scattered threads of the realm began to draw together. It was during these early years that the tale of Excalibur took root. As the chronicles say, the sword in the stone was broken in battle, shattered, perhaps, by the weight of the world it sought to hold. Seeing his despair, Merlin led the young king to a quiet lake surrounded by mist. There, as dawn touched the water, a pale hand rose from the surface, bearing a blade of light. The sword shimmered as if forged from the horizon itself, its edge neither silver nor flame, but something beyond both. Arthur took it, and the lake closed again, leaving only ripples and reflection. The gift of Excalibur was more than a weapon. It was a covenant. The Lady of the Lake, whose realm lay between life and dream, had given the king a symbol of divine sanction. Its scabbard, the stories say, held greater power than the sword itself. For while Arthur wore it, no wound could strike him down. Yet even in that blessing lingered the quiet warning of all miracles, that every gift bears the shadow of its loss. With Excalibur at his side, Arthur began to build what history would remember as Camelot. It was not a single city at first, but a spirit that gathered around him a harmony of justice and courage, a vision of what men might become when guided by honor rather than greed. His court attracted knights and scholars, dreamers and poets, all drawn to the light of the new order. Around the king's table, the seeds of legend took root. Men like Gawain, whose strength was as steady as the earth, Percival, pure of heart and thought, and Lancelot, the foreign knight, whose valor and sorrow would one day test the very soul of the realm. Merlin watched their gathering with both pride and melancholy. He knew that Camelot was more than a kingdom. It was a vision of balance, a moment of grace that could not last forever. Yet he also knew that such moments are what give meaning to the ages. He guided Arthur not toward immortality, but toward goodness. For only goodness, once spoken into the world, resists decay. In those days, the land flourished. The fields grew rich again, and the old roads, long broken, filled with travelers who spoke not of war, but of wonder. Songs were written in the marketplaces. Bells rang in towns that had forgotten the sound of peace. The kingdom seemed to breathe, and in that breath lay the first true calm since the empire's fall. People began to call it the Golden Age, though even then, the gold was only beginning to glow. At the heart of this new order stood the Round Table. The idea was simple yet profound, a table without head or foot, where every knight sat as equal in worth and voice. It was Merlin's suggestion, drawn perhaps from older symbols of unity. To Arthur, it was a reminder that kingship was service, not privilege. Around that circle, oaths were sworn to protect the helpless, to speak truth, to honor faith and love. And for a time, those oaths were kept. But history, even in its gentlest moments, carries the faint echo of what will come. Beneath the laughter of Camelot's feast halls, the seeds of sorrow were already sown. The passions that would one day unravel the dream were quiet, then barely whispers among the golden light. But Merlin felt them like a chill beneath spring air. He said nothing. The story had to unfold, as all stories do, each joy holding its own ending. Still, in that brief and radiant span, Arthur's world stood whole. The swords were sheathed, the laws were just, and men believed once more that goodness could be made visible. The sword that had risen from water shone on banners, its name whispered as a prayer. Excalibur. It was the symbol of the balance between strength and grace, between heaven and earth. To wield it was to remember that even power must bow to wisdom. As the sun set over the hills of Logres, Merlin often watched the young king from afar, seated in his court, surrounded by the laughter of friends and the songs of loyalty. He smiled, knowing that he was witnessing a dream realized, a brief, perfect harmony between what men are and what they long to be. For such moments, however fleeting, the world turns more gently. Camelot ripened like a season fulfilled. The kingdom stood not only as a fortress of men, but as an idea that justice could live in the world if guided by mercy. In those years of calm, Arthur grew from promise into legend, though he never thought of himself that way. He walked among his people, spoke softly, judged fairly, and rode often into the countryside where once there had been only ruin. The people blessed his name not for fear or awe, but from the strange warmth that his reign carried. For a while, It seemed that the world itself had remembered how to hope. Yet even in peace, destiny does not rest. The Round Table, born in unity, began to draw the restless spirit of the age, men who dreamed of proving their worth through deeds beyond the ordinary. They sought quests, not battles, challenges that tested the soul. The land, healed by order, now called for meaning. And so the knights rode to slay dragons, to rescue the lost, to seek the symbols that might grant grace to mankind. Some returned with tales that would echo through centuries. Others were never seen again, leaving only silence where their songs had been. Among them rode Lancelot du Lac, the foreign knight from across the sea, whose name became both glory and grief. He was unmatched in courage, unshaken in courtesy, and devoted beyond measure to the ideals of the king he served. Yet destiny, ever subtle, set another test before him, one that no sword could answer. For Lancelot's heart was not wholly his own. It was drawn toward Guinevere, Arthur's queen, whose grace and intelligence made her beloved by all. Their bond began in loyalty and grew in admiration. But affection has a way of softening the walls duty builds. Love, even the purest kind, can cast a long shadow. Merlin, who watched all things unfold, sensed the quiet fracture forming beneath the glitter of the court. But prophecy is not power. It is awareness. He could see what might come, yet he could not unmake it. He would often wander to the edges of Camelot, into the forests, where the air was thick with memory. There he would listen to the wind moving through the trees, as though it carried whispers from older ages. The world had given Arthur every gift, and yet the balance of all gifts is that they cannot remain untested. In those years, the king turned increasingly toward the idea of the sacred. The peace of his land felt incomplete, as though earthly justice, no matter how pure, still longed for divine confirmation. Thus began the early murmurs of the greatest quest of all, the search for the Holy Grail. Its story had drifted into Britain from far shores, carried by pilgrims and dreamers. A vessel of mysterious light, said to have held the blood of Christ, guarded by angels and lost to mortal sight. To find it was to glimpse perfection itself, the bridge between heaven and man. When the vision of the Grail appeared before the knights, and as some say it did, glowing softly in the great hall one Pentecost morning, it filled their hearts with both awe and despair. Awe because they had witnessed a miracle, despair because they knew that no mortal kingdom could contain such holiness. The Round Table, once whole, began to scatter. Each knight vowed to seek the Grail, believing his soul might be the one to find it. And so they rode out. Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, Galahad, each driven by a different kind of faith. Camelot, for the first time, grew quiet. The laughter faded. The long halls stood half empty, the torches burning low. Arthur remained bound by the crown that others had sought for him. He watched them go, his heart torn between pride and sorrow. The Grail was a symbol of light, yet in its pursuit, it divided the unity he had built. Peace, he realized, is not kept by law alone, but by companionship. And now his companions were gone, chasing visions across the wilderness of the soul. The king who had once united the realm sat alone beside Excalibur, the blade that had risen from the lake, and wondered if even the purest dream could last. Time passed in silence. News returned in fragments of quests abandoned, of knights who perished in strange lands, of Galahad, the purest among them, who found the Grail only to vanish from the world. His purpose fulfilled. The Round Tables. Glory dimmed. The songs grew slower, softer, filled with longing rather than triumph. And in that stillness, the threads of fate began to draw their final pattern. It was then that Mordred came to court. Some called him nephew, others whispered son, born of confusion and error, a shadow from Arthur's own past. The chronicles differ, but all agree that he was sharp of mind and cold of heart, a mirror that reflected the king's virtues in reverse. Where Arthur sought harmony, Mordred sought control. Where the king ruled by love, the younger man sought to rule by certainty. He grew quickly in favor, speaking honeyed words of loyalty while weaving doubt in quiet corners. Guinevere, wearied by solitude, and the distance between her and her king struggled against the storm in her heart. Lancelot had returned from his own wanderings, broken by visions and unable to find peace. Between them, love rekindled, not out of rebellion, but from the ache of human need. When the truth came to light, the court that had once stood as the beacon of honor found itself trembling on the edge of ruin. Arthur, torn between justice and forgiveness, faced the cruelest choice of all, to uphold the laws he had sworn to embody or to pardon those he loved most. Merlin was gone by then. Some say he was trapped by enchantment, others that he simply withdrew, knowing the time of magic had passed. Without his counsel, the king stood alone beneath the weight of destiny. The sword that had united the land now gleamed as a reminder of what unity costs. The Round Table, once the perfect circle, lay broken, its edges uneven, its oaths unfulfilled, and so the peace of Camelot faded, not with thunder, but with silence. The great halls grew cold. The banners sagged in the wind. The dream that had once seemed eternal began to dissolve like mist at dawn. Yet even as it passed, it left behind something that would outlast kings and castles, the memory of what mankind once almost achieved. For in the story of Arthur, as in all stories that endure, the ending is not defeat, but reflection. The sword that rose from the lake, the hand that offered it, the circle of knights who once believed all became part of a greater rhythm, the eternal dance between light and shadow. The age of miracles waned, but its echo remained, whispering through centuries that goodness, though fragile, is never wasted. That dreams, though broken, still leave the world more beautiful than before. The dream of Camelot. For a time, it seemed the light of Camelot would never fade. The realm had known sorrow and survived it, had tasted doubt and found strength still waiting in the heart of its people. In those quiet years, Arthur ruled not as a conqueror nor as a legend, but as a man who had learned the true weight of peace. The wars had grown distant, the borders firm, the fields full. The sound of the forge replaced the clash of arms. Children grew up without fear of the horizon, and the bards who once sang of victory now sang of plenty. It was a mature age, the calm after the storm, when even the king's crown seemed to rest lighter upon his head. Arthur often walked among his people dressed simply, speaking little, as though he listened to the rhythm of the land itself. He was older now, but the light that had guided him since youth still shone behind his eyes. He had begun to understand that leadership is not only to act, but to endure, to keep faith. Even when the story around you begins to quiet, the court of Camelot had changed too. The hall where once laughter rang through nights of feasting now echoed with softer sounds. The rustle of parchment, the murmur of counsel, the distant music of harps played for reflection rather than joy. The knights who remained were no longer eager for quests. They had seen enough of the world's vastness and its ache. Some had laid down their arms entirely, tending the lands they had sworn to defend. Others became teachers to the young, passing on what wisdom their journeys had earned them. In this stillness, the kingdom found a gentler kind of greatness. Guinevere, ever graceful, devoted herself to the quiet betterment of the court. The storm of scandal that had once shadowed her name had softened into forgiveness, not through decree, but through time's tender patience. She had learned that remorse, when met with humility, becomes a kind of strength. Her presence brought dignity to every hall she entered, and even the poorest of women in distant villages spoke her name with fondness. For though the queen's life had been marked by sorrow, her bearing taught that even sorrow can be borne beautifully. Arthur loved her still, though theirs had become a love more solemn than passionate. They spoke often, walked together in the gardens at dusk, and shared long silences that spoke of understanding. Between them, words were no longer needed. They both knew the dream they had built together, however imperfect, had changed the shape of the world, and though shadows lingered on the edge of their hearts, there was peace in the knowledge that they had tried to build something pure. But dreams, like dawn, are bound to fade. Even as Camelot basked in its late serenity, the signs of change began to stir. Rumors of unrest flickered at the borders of old enemies regrouping, of new powers rising beyond the sea. Yet what threatened Camelot most was not from without, but from within. The slow wearing down of faith. Men who had once sworn oaths of knighthood began to question whether those oaths still mattered in a world at peace. The young, who had never known war, found the discipline of the Round Table burdensome. Ideals once sacred now seemed distant, even quaint. Arthur saw it all, and said little. He knew that no reign, however noble, could preserve the purity of its beginnings. Every order bears within it the seed of its own forgetting. But he held the hope, the quiet, stubborn hope, that what had been built might yet endure in spirit, even if its walls one day crumbled. To the end, he believed that goodness, once made real, cannot die. There were still festivals in Camelot then, though smaller, quieter than before. The king would sit beneath a canopy of oak leaves, watching the people dance in circles to the sound of flutes. The sunlight glimmered on banners, dyed deep red and blue, colors faded from years of celebration. Children would climb the steps to offer flowers at his feet, and he would bend to accept them, smiling faintly, as though each bloom carried a promise he wished he could keep. Those who looked upon him saw not a hero, but something rarer, a man who had grown wise enough to understand his own myth. Merlin's absence hung over these days like a distant bell. Some whispered that he still watched, unseen, from the wild places of the earth. Others believed he had passed into legend entirely, becoming part of the wind that stirred the mists at dawn. Arthur sometimes rode alone to the forest's edge, to the lake where Excalibur had first risen. There, in the hush of morning, he would sit and gaze at the water's surface, half expecting to see the pale hand rise again. But the lake remained still, reflecting only the sky, as though reminding him that the age of miracles had given way to the age of remembrance. The years drew him inward. He became quieter, gentler, and yet more solemn. He spoke of the Round Table not as a triumph, but as a leçon that equality and justice are fragile things, always in need of tending. He urged his knights to look beyond the sword, to find meaning in service rather than in conquest. The truest battle, he once said, is to keep one's heart kind. It was a lesson few understood in their youth, but one that echoed long after his voice was gone. And yet, beneath this golden calm, the wheel of fate continued its patient turn. Modred, grown now into a man of commanding presence, had gained a place of influence in court. To the people he seemed loyal and strong, a defender of tradition, but those who looked closer saw something colder in him, a hunger not for justice, but for certainty. The kind that leaves no room for grace. He admired the order Arthur had built, but resented the gentleness that sustained it. In his mind, the kingdom's peace had made it weak. He watched the aging king and saw opportunity in the slow quieting of Camelot's strength. The old ideals, he thought, could not last in a world that demanded rule, not reverence. And so, as the candles burned low in the hall and the last songs faded, he began to weave his own design. But for now, the world still slept. Beneath the dream, the rivers gleamed, the fields whispered, and the towers of Camelot shone like polished ivory in the sun. Those who lived then did not yet know they were walking within a story's final calm, the hush before history exhales. It was the twilight of an age, soft and golden, when everything seemed eternal. And perhaps, in that illusion, there was truth. For in memory, Camelot never truly falls. The twilight of Arthur's reign came not as a storm, but as a slow dimming, a soft unraveling of all that had once shone so brightly. The realm still prospered in outward form. The harvests were strong, the courts orderly, the roads safe, but the light within the hearts of men had begun to wane. The songs of the Round Table no longer spoke of unity. They spoke of nostalgia, and nostalgia, though sweet, is the herald of endings. Arthur felt it in the air, that faint brittleness that comes when faith becomes memory. He would rise before dawn and walk through the courtyards of Camelot, while the mist still hung over the stones. The world seemed older then, and so did he. He no longer carried Excalibur at all times. It rested now in the Hall of Relics, gleaming softly beneath its shroud of silk. The sword that had once defined him had become a symbol of what was passing away. Power, he had come to understand, is only ever borrowed. Guinevere watched him with quiet sadness. They had found peace between them, but it was the peace of two souls who had known too much. Her laughter had grown gentler, her words fewer. She tended to the cloisters, to the gardens, to the weaving of tapestries that told the story of their reign, not as glory, but as remembrance. Sometimes she would pause, the thread between her fingers, and look out across the hills beyond the city walls. The world seemed smaller now, contained within memory's fragile frame. Mordred, in those same days, moved quietly through the court. His voice carried a calm authority that others found reassuring. He spoke of renewal, of strength, of a return to the clarity of old values. Yet beneath his reasoned tone lay the sharp edge of ambition. He whispered that Arthur had grown weary, that Camelot needed new blood, a new hand upon the sword. And though few would speak it aloud, many began to listen. For when peace endures too long, even peace begins to feel like constraint. Arthur sensed the unease but hoped still to heal it. He called a council, summoning all his lords and knights to reaffirm their oaths. The great hall filled once more with the sound of armor and the murmur of old friendships. The round table shone beneath the torches, its surface polished smooth by decades of hands. As Arthur looked upon them, his brothers in arms, his companions through victory and despair, he felt again the old ache of love for them. He spoke, not as a king, but as a man, of unity, of duty, of the fleeting grace of their age. His voice trembled with weariness, but also with truth. Yet even as he spoke, the divisions ran deep. Some had come only to see whether the crown still fit the man who wore it, and among them, Mordred listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When the meeting ended, and the candles burned low, the old harmony seemed to flicker like a flame in wind. It was not long after that news came from the northern coast, rumors of a renewed Saxon threat. Arthur, ever bound by duty, resolved to lead the defense himself. He left Camelot in Mordred's care, trusting the young man to guard both crown and queen until his return. Guinevere urged caution, her intuition whispering unease, but the king's sense of honor left no room for doubt. He rode out once more into the world that had once crowned him, his banner bearing the image of the Dragon of Britain, its colors faded but proud. While Arthur rode to war, Camelot shifted. Mordred left with power in his hands, saw at last his chance to claim it. He declared himself king, alleging that Arthur had fallen in battle and that the throne must not stand empty. Some believed him, eager for change. Others feared his cold certainty but lacked the will to resist. Guinevere was taken and confined within her own chambers, treated with courtesy, yet watched by those who no longer served her. The bells of Camelot rang, not in mourning, but an uneasy proclamation. When word reached Arthur of this betrayal, it struck him not as anger, but as sorrow. He had known that the dream was fragile, but to see it broken by his own blood was a wound beyond all reckoning. Still, he gathered what loyal men remained and marched south. The journey was long and quiet. The lands he passed through seemed subdued, their people unsure whom to serve. The banners of Camelot hung still but heavy, like memories too old to stir in the wind. The two armies met at Camelot, beside a misted plain where river and moor entwined. The morning was gray, the sky low and vast. Neither side wished to begin the fight, it seemed. Even to them, a battle between reflections, between two halves of the same dream. Yet the first blow fell by accident, as history so often turns. A sword drawn in confusion, a startled cry, and then the roar of men too long bound by silence. The field erupted, and with it, the last dream of Camelot. Arthur fought with the calm of inevitability. He was no longer the youth who had pulled a sword from stone, nor the radiant king who had united a realm. He was simply the last defender of what had been good. Mordred pressed him fiercely, his blade driven by bitterness rather than faith. When at last they met face to face, Tituopo said a heartbeat of stillness before the end. Words were spoken that no chronicle preserves. Then the clash came, and the world seemed to hold its breath. When the mist cleared, both men lay wounded. Mordred fell first, his ambition spent, his name sealed in tragedy. Arthur, pierced and weary, leaned upon his sword, the ground beneath him darkened by blood and rain. Around him, the field was silent save for the wind. The last of his knights came to him then, faithful Bedivere, and the king, knowing the time had come, spoke his final command, to take Excalibur and return it to the lake from which it had come. Bedivere went but twice. He hesitated, unable to cast so sacred a relic away. Only at the third bidding did he obey. As the sword arced through the air and touched the water, the lake stirred, and a hand rose once more, white and calm, catching it before it sank. The hand lifted the blade high, then drew it slowly beneath the surface. The ripples spread, and the lake was still again. Arthur, upon hearing the tale, smiled faintly. His task was done. He was borne from the field to the shores of Avalon, where legend says the mists parted to receive him. Whether he died there or merely slept is a question the centuries have never settled. But those who tell his story agree on this, that the king was promised to return when Britain should most need him again, and so his legend endured, not as a memory of failure, but as a promise of renewal. Camelot itself faded, its towers lost to time, its songs turned to echoes. Yet the dream it represented, that justice, courage, and compassion might coexist, continued to haunt the hearts of men. In every age, in every weary world, someone recalls the whisper. Once there was a king who ruled not by might, but by the grace of his heart, and in that whisper, Arthur lives still. So ends the age of the Round Table, not with a cry, but with the siege, a tale of brightness that knew its own impermanence, and in knowing it, became immortal. For the dream of Camelot is not bound to stone or sword. It lingers where the human spirit still longs for harmony, where someone, in the quiet between battles, still believes that a just heart can heal the world. Avalon, and after the battle was over, and the mists had closed, upon the plain of Camelot, the earth drank deeply of silence. No sound of victory, no cry of defeat, only the faint sighing of wind through the reeds, as though the world itself mourned in secret. Where armies had clashed, only smoke remained, and beyond the gray horizon, the shape of a single barge gliding softly across the waters. Upon it lay the wounded king, his armor dulled by blood and rain, his crown resting beside him like a forgotten star. 3 queens stood aboard that vessel, their faces hidden beneath veils as pale as moonlight. They did not speak. Their presence felt older than any mortal oath, serene, eternal, patient. They bore Arthur toward the isle called Avalon, a place both within and beyond the world, where time moves as gently as breath. The river carried him through fog thick with the scent of apple blossom, toward a shore that glimmered faintly beneath unseen light. The stories say that Avalon was not death, but a threshold, a realm of healing, not offending. Its air shimmered with quiet magic, its waters pure and cool. There, Arthur's wounds were tended by hands that asked no questions. Some say he fell into deep sleep. Others, that he spoke with beings who dwell beyond fate. No one truly knows, but all who tell his tale agree that the king did not vanish. He rested, waiting for the hour when the world might call him back. Back in Britain, word of Camelot spread like wind through autumn fields. The people wept not for a fallen ruler, but for the fading of something greater, the loss of hope that had shaped their hearts. Camelot's towers still stood for a time, but without its spirit, the city grew hollow. The Round Table, once the symbol of unity, was dismantled and scattered. Its pieces found their way into shrines and chapels, relics of a vanished age. The land did not crumble, it endured, but the glow that had made it radiant dimmed. Bards began to wander again, carrying news, stories, and fragments of memory. They spoke of the great battle, of the betrayal, and the redemption that followed. They sang of the king's passing and of his promise to return. Each tale was told a little differently, as though the truth had turned to mist, like Avalon itself, shifting, elusive, yet always near. In one version, Arthur sails into the west. In another, he walks the green meadows of Avalon, unaged and unbroken. In all, his name remains a light in the dark. And so began the transformation, from history into myth. What had once been the memory of a man became the mirror of an ideal. The chroniclers of later centuries, unsure of where truth ended and dream began, still wrote his story with reverence. They could not bear the thought that such goodness should simply vanish. Instead, they believed that the land itself held him, that the hills, the rivers, the ancient stones, whispered his name in their own tongue. To them, Arthur was not gone. He had become the spirit of the island. As centuries passed, the old religion faded, and new faiths took root. Yet the Arthurian dream endured. Monks copied the legends into illuminated manuscripts, each letter glowing with gold, as though the very act of writing kept his light alive. In monasteries and courts alike, men spoke of Camelot not as a place that once existed, but as a state of the soul, the harmony between strength and virtue, courage and mercy. The poets of later ages reshaped the tale again and again. Some saw Arthur as a symbol of divine kingship, others as a reminder of the frailty of human striving. To some, he was the warrior who would rise again when the world fell into darkness. To others, he was the quiet guardian of dreams, resting beneath the hills, watching, waiting. The myth expanded like ripples from a stone dropped long ago into still water. Every age found in it what it most needed: hope, order, redemption, or warning. Yet even as his legend grew, the essence remained unchanged. That once, there was a moment in the long night of history when humanity reached toward the light. The dream of Camelot was not of perfection, but of balance, a fleeting vision of what the world might be when men and women act with grace instead of pride. And perhaps that is why Arthur's story endures, for it does not promise that goodness will prevail forever, only that it can. There are places still quiet, forgotten valleys where the mist gathers thick at dawn, where travelers swear they hear faint music on the wind. Some say it is the echo of distant bells, others the whisper of oars moving through unseen waters. And sometimes, when the light falls just right upon the horizon, the outline of an island appears, green, peaceful, timeless. Those who have seen it never agree on its shape, but all describe the same feeling, a calm certainty that beyond the veil of the ordinary world, something waits. Arthur's knights, too, became spirits of story. Gawain's loyalty, Percival's innocence, Lancelot's sorrow. They each took on lives of their own, wandering through the songs and scriptures of later ages. The world forgot their faces, but remembered their virtues, the code they lived by: to protect, to serve. Tosig Truth became the quiet foundation of chivalry that shaped the centuries that followed. The age of miracles had ended, but the age of ideals had begun. And so, from the silence after battle, a new kind of life began. Not of kings and swords, but of memory and meaning. Arthur had passed from man to myth, from ruler to reminder. The island of Avalon receded into legend, but its promise remained, that someday, when the world again stands upon the edge of despair, the king will return, not in might, but in mercy. Time, which erases empires and softens stone, could not erase the story of Arthur. In abbeys and castles, in the quiet corners of candlelit rooms, his tale was whispered, written. Each hand that copied his name left something of its own heart in the ink. The old chroniclers, like Geoffrey of Monmouth and later Thomas Malory, did not claim to invent. They claimed to remember. They gathered fragments, Latin verses, Welsh songs, Breton dreams, and wove them together into something whole. In their words, the forgotten warrior became a king again, crowned not in iron but in imagination. By the 13th century, the legend had spread far beyond the mists of Britain. Across the Channel, in the courts of France, troubadours sang of chivalry and devotion, of knights who rode not for conquest but for the heart's purity. Lancelot became their hero, and through him, Arthur's court turned into a mirror for their own age, a place of courtly love, of sacred quests, of the tension between loyalty and desire. The story shifted, as all living things do. In one version, it was a moral lesson. In another, a dream of gentleness in a harsh world. And still the heart of it remained unchanged. The Round Table, equal, fair, eternal, continued to stand as the world's quiet protest against tyranny. The Grail, whether cup or symbol, continued to shimmer beyond reach, reminding humankind that the truest rewards are never those we hold in our hands. In every retelling, the soul of the story persisted. That honor might yet survive in a world that forgets it. That hope might still awaken, even in the shadow of ruin. As centuries turned, the age of swords gave way to the age of books. Painters imagined Avalon bathed in gold. Poets dreamed of the king's return. Tennyson, in his long and mournful music, gave the Victorian world its vision of Arthur. Not the conqueror, but the conscience of a fading empire. Ennis versus Camelot was already half a memory, glowing faintly like embers at dusk. Yet even then, listeners felt something stir within an ancient recognition, as though they, too, had once stood among those shining halls. Scholars debated whether Arthur ever lived, but the question mattered less than the meaning. The legend had become a vessel, carrying what each age most longed for. To the medieval knight, he was the perfect ruler. To the monk, a symbol of divine order. To the dreamer, the promise that somewhere beyond decay, there lies renewal. And to the modern listener, weary of noise and haste, Arthur is still the quiet assurance that goodness once walked among us, and may do so again. It is said that beneath certain hills, in Wales, in Cornwall, in Scotland, Arthur sleeps, still, surrounded by his knights. They rest in a vast cavern lit by neither torch nor sun, their armor untarnished, their swords unbroken. Should peril come upon the land, they will rise. The sound of hoofbeats will echo once more through the valleys, and the banner of the dragon will unfurl against the dawn. But perhaps, as the old poets hinted, the return of the king is not of the body but of the spirit. That each time, kindness triumphs over cruelty. Each time, truth stands against the easy lie. A part of Arthur wakes again. The modern world, with its restless machines and bright, sleepless lights, rarely pauses to listen. Yet the legend waits patiently beneath it all. It lingers in the rhythm of waves against old shores, in the hush of libraries, in the forgotten stone circles that still catch the morning sun. There is something in those quiet places that remembers. Perhaps that is why the story endures, not because we believe it literally, but because we need it. The idea that once there was a golden age, however brief, reminds us that humanity can be better than it is. In this way, Arthur's true kingdom was never lost. It lives wherever compassion is stronger than ambition, wherever wisdom speaks softly and is still heard. It lives in the lessons of history, in the patience of those who build rather than destroy, in the courage of those who choose mercy. The Isle of Avalon is not a place upon any map. It is a memory that stirs whenever a weary heart dreams of peace. So the legend drifts through time, as gentle as mist over a sleeping lake. It has no ending, because it needs none. The tale of Arthur began in battle, but concludes in stillness, not with the clamor of victory, but with the quiet faith that something noble endures. And in that silence, if one listens carefully, one might still hear the faintest sound of oars dipping into calm water, carrying the king deeper into the light. The mists close once more. The land sleeps, and somewhere beyond the veil, Avalon glimmers not as a lost world, but as a promise kept in the heart of humankind. And so, the mists close around Avalon once more. The king sleeps, the land rests, and the story settles into silence, as all stories must. Thank you, dear listener, for traveling with us through these ancient echoes of time. If this story brought you peace, or helped you drift into calm dreams, please subscribe to our channel. Go to sleep, historian. Your support helps us bring more quiet journeys into history's forgotten heart. Until we meet again, may your night be gentle and your dreams timeless.